Welcome to everyone, and most welcome to Ilan Pappe, our major guest today, the speaker, lecturer this afternoon. We really appreciate having you with us. Ilan Pappe, of course, professor, historian, a senior lecturer, researcher, and an author of a most important book named The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I think everybody should read it. It is to be bought downstairs. And also, of course, author of several other important books. Thank you indeed, Ilan Pappe, for coming to be with us. We really look forward to hear your lecture, your speech. So please.
Thank you, Trond. Thank you all for attending and sharing with us this event. I want to thank the organizers. I know it's not easy to track me down. It's even more difficult to bring me over, but I'm always happy to be here. It's the third time I speak in this building, so I feel at home, at ease, and that should make it even a more pleasurable and possible event. I would like tonight, this evening, to speak about a new roadmap to Palestine. I think it's very difficult for political elites, for politicians in general, to divert and fundamentally change common practices and attitudes. There's a certain wisdom, common wisdom, on which the issue of Palestine is being dealt with and being engaged with for the last 20 years in a way that is accepted by most political elites in the world, be they governments, mainstream media, mainstream academia. And even if that common wisdom, even if that common understanding of what should be done in Palestine is not working, I don't think politicians have the ability, because of the inertia of politics, to make a U-turn where you need a U-turn, to take a deep breath and change fundamentally the perspective of the problem in order to try something else, because the one perception that we all share is not working. But I think activists, academics, intellectuals who have more time on their side and less pressures on them are bound, are committed to offer alternatives, especially when the common wisdom seems to produce not peace or resolutions, but rather more bloodshed on the ground. And I think that's what I'm doing here tonight, and I'm not the only one. There's a known Jewish joke which says, maybe it's not a joke, but it's kind of a saying, that says that when you lose a key, don't look for it under the lamp where there is light, but look for it where you have lost it. And I feel that the so-called peace effort, in the case of Palestine, based on the two-state solution, based on the assumption that you have two national movements who need international intervention of a mature grown-up in order to come to some sort of an agreement, has been a congregation of very well-intentioned people under a big street lamp, but far away from the key that was lost. And I would like this evening to describe again the key for those of us who forgot what the key looked like. And there's nothing more symbolic in Palestine than a key when one talks about the Palestinian tragedy, and when one speaks about the one thing the Palestinian peace process has not dealt with, which is the right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their homeland. There are two issues that need to be reconsidered when Palestine, or the reality in Palestine, is being engaged with, and this came to the fore very forcefully during the last summer when Israel viciously assaulted the Gaza Strip. The first thing is the need to maintain at every moment when you discuss Palestine the historical context of Palestine. The greatest Israeli achievement has been for years to convince the Western media and the Western political elite that there is no historical context to Palestine. And therefore, when you judge what should be your reaction to the Israeli assault on Gaza, you have to look at it, according to Israel, as an event that began with the launching of rockets by the Hamas into Israel. That's when the conflict in Gaza began, and therefore Israel is in a position of self-defense. For some reasons, which I don't have the time to go into here now, this kind of ahistorical perception of any event in the history of Palestine has been successfully conveyed by the Israelis throughout the years. And when you have difficult times as we have today, when there are other atrocities happening in the Middle East, in places such as Syria, Iraq, and in other places, it's even more difficult to convince politicians and journalists and academics not to forget the historical context of Palestine, and not just to compare what happened in the Gaza Strip in this summer to what goes on today in Iraq and Syria, but not to forget that what you see in Palestine in 2014 is not different from what you saw in Palestine in 2012, in 2009, in 1982, and above all, in 1948. So I think that one of the most important issues we have to push forward is to demand our world, which has a very short span of attention and patience, not to forget the historical context when it comes to Palestine. Because if you forget the historical context, then you really think that Palestine is only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then you really think that the Palestinians are only the people who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then you really think that the only way to achieve peace is to solve the problem of only the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then you come to the conclusion that actually the conflict began in 1967. And if you solve the problem or the fate of the areas that Israel occupied in 1967, then you'll bring peace, justice, and reconciliation into Palestine. This has been the congregation under the street lamp, discussing Palestine as if only 20% of the homeland is Palestine, discussing Palestinians if only half of the Palestinians are Palestinians. And although the light under the street lamp was very clear, not surprisingly, the key was not found, the key for peace, justice, and reconciliation, because it was far away elsewhere. Now, I am a history professor, and when I see people sitting like this, I cannot resist from giving you a short historical lesson, so don't be offended. That's usually my natural kind of inclination. But I think it is important, the kind of short journey into history that I would like to do before I will talk about the second aspect that is needed in order to forge a different roadmap to Palestine. I think that it's very important to have a clear historical context that will explain to us why Israel so viciously attacked the people of Gaza in the last summer. If you give superficial explanations, if you only try to explain it by political ambitions of this particular Israeli government, you're going to miss the point and you're not going to preempt the next inevitable attack on Gaza. Hopefully it will never come, but unfortunately it's probably on the cards in the next few years. To have a proper historical context, you have to do something that in Europe people are afraid of doing, for good historical reasons, but not justified ones. You have to understand the real nature of the Zionist project. And I'm speaking to you as an Israeli Jew, someone who has been a Zionist, someone who knows what it means to be the product of Zionist education, indoctrination, and someone who knows the nature of the ideology, its ambition from the inside. I'm not an anti-Semite, for that I will have to hate myself, but I am an anti-Zionist because I do believe in human rights and civil rights as a universal principle, not as a principle that can be accorded to one but not to the other. And the Zionist movement began as a noble movement that was seeking to create outside of Europe a democratic outfit, because Europe did not accept the Jews. And these Jews said, we want to be democratic, we want to be part of the West, but the West does not accept us. So they went elsewhere to build a democratic outfit. And there was nothing wrong with that idea. But when they chose Palestine as the space in which to create a democracy, they added something to this idea of a democracy, which is the bane, which is the source of all evil in Israel and Palestine today. They tried to do the impossible. They tried to create an ethnic democracy. They claimed that the only way to retain Jewish democracy is by claiming an absolute majority in whatever place on the globe you will be. You need Jewish exclusivity in order to maintain democracy. Now, this is contrary to the idea of democracy. Democracy is not based on ethnic exclusivity. Democracy means that everybody is an equal citizen in a democratic system. And it does not discriminate people according to their religion, nationality, or ethnicity. And that was the poor fate of the Palestinians in many ways. That although they were very hospitable to the early Zionists who came, most of them very poor and destitute, running away from persecution, they later on found out that these newcomers envision a homeland where the native people of Palestine cannot be part of. Not in the name of Judaism, not in the name of any racist ideology that was rampant in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. One does not have to depict Zionism worse than what it is. But in the name, unfortunately, of democracy. In the name of democracy, Zionism claimed that in order for the Jewish experience in Palestine to exist, Palestine has to be with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And in order to exist, the Zionist movement has to acquire as much of Palestine as possible. Now, until the 1930s, the Zionist movement was unable to fulfill such a vision of a Jewish democracy. But once Britain, which ruled Palestine until 1948, decided to leave Palestine and refer it to the international community, the Zionist movement seized upon an historical opportunity and ethnically cleansed as many Palestinians as it could and took over as much of Palestine as it could. In more exact terms, it took over 80% of Palestine and expelled half of Palestine's population. The international community, totally confused about what is Zionism, what is Judaism, what is Jewish nationalism, what is the Jewish question in Europe after the Holocaust, could not ask for a better solution in order not to deal with the Jewish problem. The idea of settling the Jews at the expense of the Palestinians in Palestine seemed the right remedy for Europe's problems. It's not surprising that Israel was one of the first states to recognize Germany as a new Germany. This was the deal. You legitimize everything that was done against the Jews in Europe by legitimizing everything the Zionist movement is doing in Palestine against the Palestinians. Now, in 1967, for whatever circumstances one would like to debate about, the Zionist movement took over 100% of Palestine. But with it, as you know, it incorporated another large number of Palestinians. And I think it's only today, with the help of declassified documentations, we understand something that many of us would understand a bit later, but I think very few of us were aware of in 1967. We now know that the Israeli government that took over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, in many ways invented the two-state solution as an idea that would allow Israel to implement unilaterally, on the ground, a new version of the ethnic cleansing of 1948. It could not expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians inside Israel that grew into 20% of the population in the same way as it did in 1948. It was very clear that the world in 1967 would not tolerate what it tolerated without one word of condemnation in 1948. So in order to fulfill a consensual Zionist vision of having as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians as possible, with the internal Zionist conviction that this is not a racist idea, this is a democratic idea, because as you can hear from Israeli politicians, even those who received Nobel Peace Prizes like Shimon Peres, the best way forward for peace is to have a Jewish absolute majority, and for that reason Israel is willing to give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in order to keep a Jewish racist state, but not in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but within Israel itself. In order to maintain that vision without risking the wrath of the world, a kind of a peace process was invented. But what we know today from the documents is we understand better what the peace process was supposed to conceal. It was supposed to conceal an Israeli consensus on two issues. One is that even if you were a liberal Zionist, you did not believe that Israel could really exist without some sort of control over the West Bank. They had different ideas about the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, everybody seems to have different ideas about the Gaza Strip. But the West Bank was regarded by Zionists who were more religious, either as the heart of ancient Israel, and therefore you cannot have a body without the heart, or a strategic asset. You needed the River Jordan to stop a possible invasion from the Eastern Front. Now, those of you who have seen the River Jordan, even at its best, which is a very lovely river, would not think that this is a natural barrier for any army. I think even a group of bariatric pensioners can, who are at least, Norwegian ones, because you are very athletic, could probably leap over it quite easily, even at the height of its flow. But this was very impressive in American military academies, when I once saw an Israeli general showing the map of Jordan to explain why Israel needs Jordan as a natural barrier. You would think the Mississippi looked like a creek next to what he was showing them on the map. Palestine itself dwarfed in comparison to the width of the River Jordan as shown by Israeli generals in the United States. So one decision was, whatever a peace process would lead to, there has to be Israeli facts on the ground that would ensure some sort of control over the West Bank. And it were the Labour Party strategists, Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, Levi Eshkol, and later on this was endorsed by Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, who said that actually you can divide the West Bank into two parts. There has to be a Palestinian part, areas densely populated by Palestinians, where Israel doesn't need direct control, and areas where Palestinians do not populate densely and could be areas of Jewish direct control. We have always to remember it was the Labour Party that sent the early settlers to colonize the West Bank. They were complicated by a messianic movement that decided to settle also inside the Palestinian areas. This was not the Labour movement idea that you will settle according to the Bible. They wanted to settle according to demography. But of course, when you settle both according to the Bible and according to demography, the West Bank looks today like a Swiss cheese full of Israeli settlement blocks. But one has to explain that this is a Zionist consensus. This is not an aberration of Zionist ideas. The second idea was that you, in no circumstances, can give any right to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to be part of substantial negotiations about their fate. And therefore they were never invited to vote, never invited to get citizenship, and were always kept in a secondary position when it came to peace negotiations. Now, this did not mean that well-intentioned Palestinians, people around the world, did not think that behind this Israeli idea of partition lay something more significant and hopeful for peace. A truly independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip could have been the beginning of a solution. There's no doubt about it. But the thing is that in 2015, looking back, you have to ask yourself, whenever was this idea on the table? Whenever was a peace initiative brought to the table by the Palestinians or by anyone representing them? We had a conference last year in Oslo with the people who brokered the peace process, FAFO, in this country. They admitted from the very beginning that the mechanism of peace as they saw it was to convince the Palestinians to accept Israeli ideas. This is again a congregation under a huge Christmas street lamp and not a search for the key. Now, in order for us to understand even better what happened in Israel, you can see the present government of Israel as a natural outcome of these two Israeli points of view. One is, we don't need to give up properly the West Bank. B, we don't have to consult properly the Palestinians and can continue with unilateral actions on the ground where the leading concept is democratic. Namely, where Palestinians live in densely populated area, the consensus, I'm not talking about the Messianic settlers, the consensus is these can be ruled from the outside. Now look what happened in the Gaza Strip. This formula works in the West Bank to a certain extent, although the simmering sounds of a third intifada show us that even in the West Bank it may not work. But in the Gaza Strip, it's so small, it is so narrow, it's 40 kilometers long and 6 kilometers wide at the widest point, that you can't have this policy of having a Jewish Gaza and a Palestinian Gaza, as you can have in the West Bank. So Sharon had this ingenious idea, we don't need a Jewish Gaza, we can take the settlers out, be seen as a peace bringers, because this could be depicted as a peaceful move, although Sharon's idea was from the very beginning that if you take the settlers out of the Gaza Strip, you can easily bomb it from the outside. It took 1.5 years since the decision of Israel to unilaterally leave the Gaza Strip when the first F-16 dropped their bombs on the most populated, dense area in the world. So the Gaza Strip in the overall Israeli strategy is a problem. Israelis think, I hope wrongly, that they have settled the issue of the West Bank, that there's no need for peace negotiations, that the international community would be busy elsewhere, and that Israel could continue with colonization of the West Bank. The Palestinians would be content with the level of autonomy they have in their own areas, and the world will not really pressure Israel to change the status quo. This is the basic Israeli perception of reality, and the lack of any international initiative, of course, strengthens this sense that basically you can continue like this. But Gaza cannot be dealt in such a way, especially not when it resists in a way which may be effective or not effective. And Israel is in a problem, in a conundrum when it comes to Gaza, and the only way it can solve the problem of Gaza is to treat Gaza as a maximum security prison and to treat the West Bank as a kind of an open prison. When you have an open prison, you have a good relationship with the prisoners in a way. And as long as they behave, there is a kind of an understanding between the wardens and the imprisoned. Of course, the people in the West Bank are incarcerated for a crime they have never committed. But it is a big mega prison, and what we saw at the background of Roger Waters' beautiful song was very concrete symbols of prison, and not wonder that in the song itself, he talks about the need to bring down prison walls. And it's not a real prison, it's a prison that incarcerates 3.5 million people. But the Gaza Strip is not an open prison. It hasn't been an open prison since 1994. It's a maximum security prison. And when it reacts, Israel reacts with the most lethal and updated weapons it has at its disposal. Recently, we also found out that some of these weapons are being used in order to experiment with new weapons so that prospective buyers could be impressed how these weapons perform against real people and not in a simulated realities. So historical context explains much better what Israel is doing in Jerusalem today. Explains much better what Israel is doing in the Nakab, ethnically cleansing the Bedouins of Israel. Explains much better the Judaization in the Galilee, the continued expropriation of land in the West Bank, and the continued strangulation of Gaza, and not to mention the refusal to deal with the Palestinian refugees' right of return. While every country around Syria, including countries like Iraq, who could probably not afford it, accepted refugees from Syria, the only rich neighbor who could really absorb refugees and refused to accept even one refugee from Syria is Israel. We have to remember that as well. Now, finally, I want to talk about something else that we need apart from historical context. Language is very important. And when you congregate under a street lamp and you enjoy the light, but you don't find the key, you tend also to talk in a language which is irrelevant to the problem you want to solve. The word occupation, although it's a very powerful word, is really not apt to describe what Israel is doing. You know, Israel existed 19 years without occupation. It already exists more than 45 years with occupation. If the occupation is greater than the country, then there's something else there. What we need to use is the term colonization. And it's very difficult because colonization is a 19th century phenomenon. But it exists in Palestine in the 21st century. Palestine is the only place that is still being colonized. And if you accept colonization as the key word to explain what you see in Palestine, it doesn't mean that you disregard the rights of the Jews in Israel. That's a mistake. When South African freedom fighters were talking about the need to decolonize South Africa, not one of them said that the whites of South Africa have to go back to their countries of origin in Holland or Germany or wherever they came from. They said that decolonization meant that the settlers who came in the 17th century to South Africa do not have the right of supremacy over the native people. That's what decolonization means. And this is not an end of occupation. This is an end of colonization, because colonization is also a mentality. It's a DNA of the Israeli society. It's a mindset. And if you don't change that mindset, and you say, I'm just taking the Israeli army out of certain parts of the West Bank, as was done in Oslo. It was done under the Oslo Accord. You do not solve the main problem in Palestine, and therefore you don't remove the main reason for the violence. So you may stop the violence for a year or two, but it will repeat itself in a far worse way, because you raise people's expectation and hopes in a false presentation of a peace process that was never there. And I will venture another new entry in a new dictionary that I would like us to consider using when we deal with Palestine. And I'm aware of how difficult that may be, apart from colonization, instead of occupation. And this is apartheid. A very important part of the noble idea of Jewish democracy. And it's noble when it's not exercised at the expense of anyone else. The noble idea of Jewish democracy can only be achieved through segregation. Apartheid means segregation. Of course, there are different kinds of apartheid. There is the petty apartheid of white South Africa, when people were asked to use different bathrooms, different buses, not to sit on the same bench. But apartheid can also mean this road is only for Jews. It can also mean the state's benefits inside Israel are only for Jews. It could also mean that only Jews are allowed to reunite with their families in Israel, but Palestinians are not. Apartheid also means encircling Tulkarem and Kalkilia with fences that only the Israelis have the keys to open that. There are different kinds of segregation. And what is important about that segregation is that this is not a temporary means to defend. It's a permanent feature of the landscape that the society that imposes them sees as very natural, as normal, and not contradicting the idea of democracy. And until people in Norway would tell the Israelis, wait a minute, this is unacceptable. We will not accept you as if you continue to practice apartheid both as an ideology and as a policy. Until that very moment, there's no one inside Israel who would tell them that this is wrong. And the last term I would like to use before I leave some time for questions and answers and comments, of course. The last term is the term I used in 2006. And this is, in fact, two terms I would like to end with. One is ethnic cleansing. When I wrote my book in 2006, all the publishers I went to refused to publish the book under this title. In Europe, it was very difficult, in America, of course, very difficult to connect the idea of ethnic cleansing with Zionist or Jewish policy. Jews cannot be colonizers, Jews cannot be ethnic cleansers, Jews cannot even be occupiers. And I told them that although ethnic cleansing is something that came out of former Yugoslavia, and was very clear in the case of former Yugoslavia, where the international legal community began to articulate very clearly what is the nature of the crime, what is the punishment for the crime. I said, I'm an historian. I'm not an international judge. I'm not going to bring Israel to the tribunal, accuse it, and decide about the verdict. I'm an academic. And as an academic, what I do, I take a general term and see whether it applies to the case study I'm interested in. And I said, now that we have so much documentation about 1948, from Palestinian sources, from Israeli sources, from United Nations sources. We know exactly what stood behind the idea to expel the Palestinians. We know exactly how the Palestinians were expelled and for what purpose. It's very clear that had this happened in the 1990s, there would have been only one international definition for what Israel did in Palestine in 1948. And that definition would have been ethnic cleansing. But I said something else. Had it been an historical chapter, a closed historical chapter, I would not use the term. I was using the term because I believed that this was going on. The Nakba continued. The ethnic cleansing continued. The very weak international reaction to the ethnic cleansing that was witnessed, was recorded by international community, meant that Israel got the message from the world that ethnic cleansing is a legitimate means for maintaining a Jewish democracy. Now, we had two kinds of tactics in Israel. One was the Labour Party, the peace camp, if you want, that said, if I'll give up territory, I will have to deal less with ethnic cleansing in order to maintain Jewish democracy. It's still a racist idea in my mind, but at least the idea was, I don't have to push people out because I'm pushing myself out of people's life. We were wrong to hail the Israelis with such views as peacemaker and give them Nobel Peace Prizes in this city. But that's a historical mistake that cannot be rectified anymore. But it was also equally important to understand that the also almost natural progression of the Israeli political system since the beginning of the 21st century brought to the fore a group of Zionist policymakers that even that idea looked to them unnecessary. And the present government of Israel is using even active ethnic cleansing in order to maintain something that is akin to Jewish democracy, although I think most of them even don't care about democracy anymore and really want to maintain Israel as a Jewish state, even if the price is to sustain a semi-apartheid system. Talk to Naftali Bennett, talk to Uri Ariel, two senior ministers in the Israeli government, and you will see that even that idea is now passé. But I think it's important to use this language, this term, because it carries legal meaning, it carries political meaning, and more important than anything else, it carries moral significance. And finally, I think we should not hesitate, and this is food for thought. I'm not saying we'll do it tomorrow. But I think those of us who want to be engaged from the outside in the Middle East and would understand, and everybody will understand, I think, in the near future, that whatever one thinks about the two-state solution, the corpse of that solution has been in the morgue for many years. Every now and then an American Secretary of State comes, takes the body out of the morgue. We think it's alive, and then we bring it back to the morgue. One day we will be invited to the funeral properly, and then maybe we can start thinking afresh of the idea. But the two-state solution is dead. You have to be 5 minutes on the ground there to understand it. But whatever one thinks about it, it's far more important to my mind, instead of engaging in a futile debate now, one state, two states, which sometimes the solidarity movement is dragged into it, I think it's far more important, and with this I will end, is to try and apply something that the West applied liberally and easily to the rest of the Middle East. And this is the term regime change. Regime change, from an American and European perspective, was applied easily to Syria, Iraq, Egypt. In fact, the West did not even consider immoral the idea that sometimes you can bring a regime change by military intervention of the West. Sometimes you can bomb people into changing their regime. The new peace movement, if one can call it, I think, on Israel and Palestine is a far more peaceful group of people. I don't think they would they long for the day that they would see American bombers over Tel Aviv trying to force a regime change. What they are looking for is something very noble and something that could settle historically in unfortunate circumstances which brought the Jews to Palestine in the late 19th century. What you have in Palestine today between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean is an equal number of a third generation of Jewish settlers and an equal number of native Palestinians. Outside of Palestine, you have a large number of Palestinian refugees. If you want to begin a very long and painful road of just reconciliation of the relationship between these three groups, one thing is clear. It cannot be done under a regime that claims ethnic supremacy or exclusivity. It has to be done under a regime that genuinely believes in democracy, genuinely believes in human rights and civil rights. And people in the West, and this will be my last sentence, I think people in the West do not understand that if you lecture to people in the Middle East or in the Muslim world about human rights and civil rights as the right way forward, and you exclude Israel from this conversation, this double talk would close the ears of the people whom you want to talk to in those parts of the world. Because you lack credibility if you allow exceptionalism of human rights and civil rights in one case and you demand it in every other case. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Ilan Pappe. It's a very serious, very important matter being discussed, and we are very happy indeed with your enlightening speech. And I'm sure that people in the audience would like to put forward comments and questions. And we have this phone, so please, you can comment on this one. If you'd like to ask questions or comment in Norwegian, I think also we can have it translated, so please, it's open for discussions and questions, please.
Yes, people, you don't see them in the back.
They don't see me. Can we have some light? They want some. They are asking for some lights. Good evening. My name is Nico Stavridis Hansen, and I'm an activist for the BDS movement here in Norway. I'm also a student of Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic. It's very interesting, obviously, to listen to Ilan Pappe for us that study the field. He's a very important historian, but he also gives us some very important tools in the fight. But right now, I would like to be the devil's advocate and ask some questions that I hear quite often. One of them is concerning the fight. We hear also from left-wing academics in the US that a two-state solution is the only one possible. I mean, you've already spoken quite a lot about why it is not this way. But I would like to, one of the arguments we hear is that colonization has happened elsewhere, that the United States, Australia, these are all the result of people moving from one place to another to start a new life. Should we not just leave history behind and start talking about what is going on today? These are questions that we have to deal with every day when we are advocating for a one-state solution. And another thing that we are often forced to discuss, especially when we are using BDS, the boycott movement. BDS stands for boycott, divestment and sanctions. I would like you also to comment whether this is a tool that should be applied when we are talking about a one-state solution. Because it's obvious that the idea of a one-state solution can be accepted by many people, but it is also how to lead people to understand that this is actually possible. So if you could just elaborate a bit on the tools that are needed to actually argue for a one-state solution.
Thank you. It is true that settler colonialism, which is the particular genre of colonialism that occurred in Palestine, namely that the settlers did not wish to be connected to a mother country but wanted to create a new identity for themselves, as happened in America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, has happened in those countries as well. And it is true that in Australia and in America, these are long closed chapters. But the reason that settler colonialism is a feature of the past in America and Australia is very sad. The reason is that they genocided the indigenous people. And therefore, they don't have to divide the country. You don't have to divide the country with people you genocide. Fortunately, and I say it seriously, fortunately for the Palestinian, Zionism is not a project of genocide. It's a project of ethnic cleansing. And as such, it means that there is still, the project itself has not been completed. And because it has not been completed, it's still very violent. But also because it's not being completed, we can still stop it from becoming an equal case study to that of Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. I don't want to stand here in 50 years' time. I won't stand here in 50 years' time anyway. But I don't want my son to stand here in 50 years' time and compare successfully what happened to the Native Americans, to the Aboriginals and the Maoris, to the Palestinians. I do hope that in 50 years' time we will say, luckily, this particular native indigenous people that showed steadfastness, that resisted ethnic cleansing, succeeded in achieving peace and justice. So I think that the idea that you have to succumb to a solution that is not working, the two-state solution, because colonialism happened elsewhere, is not very relevant. One can fully understand people in the West Bank who want to see the back of the Israeli soldiers and believing that maybe a two-state solution would end the military rule. That's a very understandable motive. I just think that in 2015 we begin to understand that the two-state solution is an umbrella of immunity to Israeli unilateral actions on the ground rather than a framework for peace, as many of us, including myself, hoped it would be. And as I said, I'm not a politician, so I want to think aloud of an alternative, because if we won't think about an alternative, it would be too late to think about alternatives. As for the second point about the BDS, could you repeat what was the point of BDS?
How it, or if you agree.
Okay, yeah, I got it. You just had to say how, because I was thinking about Native Americans and immediately I got it. I think for people like myself from the inside, to come and support the idea of drastic pressure on your own society, even before you think about academic boycott, which is even more problematic to my mind, to come to that point, you have to be convinced that the ability of change from within is not on the cards. I mean, as long as you are convinced that a proper peace process, a process of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians would change the Israeli mindset to such a degree that reconciliation is possible, you don't bring up the idea of boycott, divestment, and sanction. I think what happens is that in 2000, my analysis and that of many others seems to be correct. There is no chance for a change from within the Israeli Jewish society. If anything, the events in Gaza last summer have brought to the fore, apart from the brutality on the ground, was the depths of racism in the Israeli society towards the Palestinian issue. I mean, you ask Palestinians inside Israel, who were great believers in the possibility of living as Palestinians in the Jewish state, and were willing to tolerate discrimination, believing that eventually there will be a better future in the relationship between Arabs and Jews. You ask them what is their main conclusion from the last summer. They were facing a profound racism, an institutional racism that will not change by itself. In fact, we know that projects of ethnic cleansing, and that's why I insist on this term, ethnic cleansing does not change, does not stop because the ethnic cleansers suddenly have different ideas. It peters out either because it has completed or because someone has stopped it forcefully. And I think that's what we are dealing with Israel today. The idea of and that's what brings the BDS to the fore. The idea is that you want to have a drastic action, and BDS is drastic. It's not a nice idea. One shouldn't excel in this, you know? It's a drastic action that is not going to bring reconciliation. Reconciliation is not going to be brought by Norwegian activists. We have tried you before in 1993, we were not impressed. We don't want Norwegian intervention. But we need you to allow us a conducive dialogue without international intervention on a much better and equal footing. You know, the rider and the horse can have a dialogue, but I would have preferred to be the rider than the horse. This is not a dialogue. And in Palestine, I'm sure you've all heard it before, what we see in Palestine is a talk, and that's the two-state solution today, and that's why we need PDS. It's talking of dividing a pizza between two sides while one side eats the pizza. That's where we are today. And I think that means that you want a drastic action to stop the further dispossession of the Palestinian, a further destruction. It would be a painful dialogue of how to settle the complexities of the Jewish existence in Israel, the Palestinian existence, the refugee issues, and I haven't even started to describe the issues of religion, tradition, secularity that the rest of the Middle East is struggling with. But we are wasting time. We are wasting time on that very convenient Lamb Street instead of going on the very unpleasant but necessary trip in the darkness to find the key.
Other comments, questions?
I just have one question.
Yeah.
Probably speak high.
Microphone.
What is happening now in Europe, a wave of recognizing Palestine. And I would like to know your opinion about it. And is it not like actually recognizing that the problem lies in 67 and the solution is in Oslo, and instead of actually opposing Israel, recognizing some pockets that maybe is not the answer?
Yeah. I will answer now as a politician, although I said I'm not. But I think it's very important to understand that Palestine is a very loaded concept. And you can recognize Palestine in 1947, in the United Nations resolution in 1947. And you look at the map of Palestine, you could say when the United Nations recognizes Palestine in 1947, it only recognizes half of Palestine, because the partition resolution offered only half of Palestine to the Palestinians. And you say rightly, if the Norwegian parliament tomorrow would recognize Palestine, it recognizes Palestine in, at best, in 20% of Palestine. However, I think the reality is far more complex than these anecdotal maps of Palestine. So it really depends. What would matter is not what the European Parliament that recognizes Palestine understand under the concept of Palestine. What matters is what Palestine would become in the next 10, 15 years. And as I said, I'm not convinced that European parliaments will play such an important role in this. I'm actually trying to convince them to play a better role in the BDS movement rather than in the peace process. But that does not depend on the temporary meaning of Palestine. A second point I would like to make is that I think that there's something very positive in this wave of recognition. I followed it very closely in London, where I now teach in England. And I tell you what impressed me to such an extent that despite my doubts, based on the same doubts that you have, I decided to fully support it. I was impressed by the level of Israeli angst and anger and pressure on the British Parliament not to recognize the state of Palestine. They were told that this is equivalent to anti-Semitism, that this is bringing back the Holocaust. That's what the Israeli ambassador told them. The fact that for the first time you have European parliamentarians who are not afraid of Israel, even when Israel uses the weapon of anti-Semitism, is very encouraging. It's very encouraging. So I think it's less an act that would have, none of the European acts has any impact on the ground. It's not going to have any impact on the ground. It has an impact on the conversation. I would have to remind you, I don't know if you are aware of this, in the United States in America, still today, in certain campuses, town halls, public spaces, the word Palestine is equivalent to terrorism. I can give you an example. The last example is a friend of mine who opened a coffee house called Palestine, and the police asked him to close it down because it intimidates the population if you call your coffee house Palestine. 15 years ago, the word Palestine was equivalent to terrorism. So I think we also have to recognize the impact of this recognition on the public conversation, and not only to take it as in a narrow definition of a fixed recognition in a two-state solution that can only end in Bantustans and not real peace. And that's why I think it's a bit more complex than that.
Flere spørsmål? Jeg tror du må komme hit for den ledningen.
Maybe you shout. Shout. It's good to shout.
Is that language in your to what extent do you think Israel uses language such as Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and how powerful is it? And also, don't you think that America being an honest broker, do you think that's is still going to work in the future, or is that going to change?
Yeah. Okay, two different questions. I think it's important to understand how the Holocaust memory is manipulated in Israel. And in my last book, The Idea of Israel, I devoted a whole chapter to this. I think it's very important. To my mind, it abuses the memory of the Holocaust. Any memory of the Holocaust that does not universalize this horrible atrocity does injustice to what happened there. And I think that the excessive use of the Holocaust in Israel today shows some sort of a panic in the face of a growing delegitimization of Israel, if not among political elites, at least in the civil society. And I think that's why it's used. It's kind of a doomsday weapon to try and stop a very natural response of people who know today what's going on the ground in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in the Nakab, in the Galilee. And the Israelis have no way of stopping it, even when they try people from Norway who want to see for themselves to come to the West Bank, even if they try to pressure local media and so on. People in this hall know more than the Israelis do, actually, what goes on today in the West Bank. So I think that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is this excessiveness. But I think there needs to be another side to it. There needs to be a proper discussion, again, with an historical context. One of the things that should not be allowed, to my mind, is what the Polish government is doing. It allows the Israeli army to reoccupy Auschwitz every day on the day when one commemorates the liberation of this horrible place. Don't know if you know, but every time there is a commemoration, the Israeli Air Force is flying over Auschwitz. The Israeli chief of the general staff gives the main speech, which means what? That the Palestinians are the new Nazis? That you liberating Palestine is liberating Auschwitz? The Polish government should not take part in it. I mean, European governments have a responsibility. It's too easy to do it by allowing the Israelis to Nazify the Palestinians in order to allow the Poles not to deal with the Nazi past. The same was done by the Czech Republic when it provided arms to Israel with which it ethnically cleansed Palestine in 1948 in order not to deal with what happened in Prague during the Second World War. These are tough issues, but we should not allow Israel to hijack sites of memory that Europeans need to visit and revisit and stay long, that commemorate the horrible things that happen on European ground. But we need a universal lesson out of it. We cannot treat Rwanda and the Belgian genocide of the people in Congo as lesser human crimes than what happened to the Jews in Europe. We need to understand that human beings can do awful things to other human beings if we didn't get it up to now. But there are a lot of human beings who can stop it from happening. And if it happened in Germany, it can also happen in Palestine. This for me is very important. The second point was about
America being the
Yeah, I think there's actually a very good book about the American dishonest brokery. It's called The Dishonest Broker by Rashid Khalidi. I recommend it to people who haven't read it. It's an excellent book that shows how America was never at any given moment an honest broker. But you know, I think things are changing in the United States. Things are really changing in the United States. We should remember that the United States was not always anti-Palestinian. Until the assassination of President Kennedy, the American administrations were quite pro-Palestinians, definitely on the issue of the refugees. This is why Israel created AIPAC in the 1950s. That's why it recruited Hollywood to do this awful film Exodus, because it was afraid that the American public opinion, in kind of a natural goodness, would identify with the Palestinians and not with the Israelis. But this has changed since 1967, as we know. But I think nowadays you can see that the Israelis are worried, and rightly so, that the younger generation of Jews even, of Jewish youngsters, are not easily identifying with Israel because of what they know. The reality is too transparent nowadays for conscientious people to ignore it, regardless whether they are Muslim, Jews or Christians. And I think that change is very important, together with other changes in the American society. America is undergoing demographic changes. And we don't have to look at the map as it is now. Unfortunately, the strongest ally of Israel in the United States today are the Christian Zionists. It's a weird alliance that Israel has with people who have a vision of the Jews being shish kebabbed in hell as a final solution. But Israel is a strange place. And, but this is the main support group that keeps Capitol Hill together with money and AIPAC in there. But I wouldn't take it in a deterministic point of view. But I come back to the last point I made in my lecture. We need to find a way to connect the issue of Palestine to two wider contexts. One is the context of human rights and civil rights all over the Middle East that the Americans seems to be so concerned with, to the point that they occupy other countries. And we have to say to them, whatever you do, which is just or unjust, in order to push forward the human rights and civil rights agenda, you will not be able to do anything properly if you exclude Israel from this conversation. That's the first context. And the second context we should insist with the Americans is the connection between social justice and the justice to Palestine. These things are connected. The people who make money in America out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are people who make money out of armed conflicts. We need a different position towards our arms industries, towards the universities that take part in arms industry, and so on. These are issues that are important to be part of the conversation, and Palestine is a very powerful symbol for many people who would like to push forward towards a more unjust world.
Another short question?
Yeah.
Yes, I have two short questions. Taking in mind this current political situation in Palestine or Israel right now, is there anybody among the political elite within Israel and Palestine who are talking about any outfits among the political elites who are talking about this one-state solution? And the second question is, the current academia of Israel, I mean the scholars of Israel, how does they look at this issue?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're amongst one of them, but in the general academia of Israel.
Yeah. Well, the political outfits, both in Israel and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and also the Palestinian parties inside Israel, all still subscribe officially to the two-state solution. I don't know of anyone who doesn't. And I think they will still do so in the next year or two. They need to be convinced that the two-state solution is dead for all intents and purposes. I don't think they are convinced. But maybe things can be beyond them. I mean, there could be huge catalytic events going on in the Middle East that may change anyway the way we look at things. But to be honest, there is no significant political force inside those sides that you mentioned. The Israeli academia is very loyal to Israel nowadays. So Israeli academics in exile talk about one state. Israeli academics inside, no, but I think there are NGOs are very convinced that this is the way forward. In fact, the civil society scene is offering alternatives that are still not accepted by the political elites, the BDS, the ODS, the One Democratic State. And that's the nature of things in history. They start with civil society conversations before politicians are convinced that it's worthwhile cherishing these kinds of views. So I think it's very important to keep the conversation, because realities on the ground show us again and again that the only way to stop the final phases of the dispossession of Palestine is to turn Israel into a rogue state that should be boycotted, and to offer the people there, regardless of what their nationality, religion, and ethnicity is, a vision of a democratic, equal existence in the future.
Shall we do the very last question?
I always thought it was the last, so I make these very powerful statements. Okay, never mind, I'll wait. Okay, that's okay.
It's Fredrik Heffermel, and we have this saying about people without a land which has taken a land without a people. They, in 1906, when they investigated the basis for a Zion in Palestine, they didn't see, the committee that came back to London hadn't seen that there was a people there. So I think there is a genocidal concept right at the foundation here. And therefore I was a bit surprised when I think you said that it is not a genocide that Israel is performing. Because as a lawyer, I think we have to look at the definition of genocide, which is laid down in the International Criminal Court statute. And it says that it is, I try to quote more precisely here, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, as with various means, for instance killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Yeah. So I can't see that this doesn't overwhelmingly fit the definition of what Israel is doing.
Yeah, well, I think Zionism still, to my mind, is a project of ethnic cleansing, which is bad enough. It's bad enough. And I think, and I wrote about it, I think the reality in Gaza turned the policy of ethnic cleansing into genocidal policy. Not because the Israelis wanted particularly to genocide the people of Gaza and not other Palestinians, but because the reality in Gaza turned it into a killing field that could only result in the long term in genocidal policies. But I think we have to keep our wits about it, because we ask people to have historical context, because we ask people to use a new language. We should be very accurate with what we describe, and the complexity of the Zionist project is that it became a huge project of fabrication. It was a simple story of European settlers coming to someone else's homeland and chasing them out. It happened before. It was not the first time that colonialists coveted someone else's land and did all they could to take over the land. In most cases, this was done by expulsion. In some cases, it was done by genocide. This is a more complex reality today because you don't have colonialism in the 21st century. And I think that it's very important to understand the kind of mentality that informs the Israeli mindset, if you want, the Israeli DNA. And that Israeli DNA is represented much better in liberal Zionists and not in right-wing Zionists. If the whole Israeli society, which may happen, would be a right-wing society, what I call neo-Zionists, we will have here 500 people. And the Norwegian government would be easily moved to take action. What really defends Israel is liberal Zionism, this idea that we are for democracy, we are part of the peace camp, we are talking with the Palestinians, we are willing to get out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And here you come and say that we are genociding people. I'm all for getting out of the settlements. How can you call me a genocider if I want to go out of the areas we occupied in '67? You can't use language that is totally irrelevant to what they are talking about. No, their problem is not that they are genociders. Their problem is that they will get another Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo because they want to be racist only in 80% of Palestine, not in 100% of Palestine. And they will build a 15-meter wall between them and the Palestinians so that they will forget about them. They would rather forget about them through a wall than forget about them by killing them. Really, they would prefer the wall to the killing. I know the Israelis, I'm one of them. They would prefer the wall. They would prefer a bus that has no Palestinians in it instead of killing the Palestinian passengers on the way to the bus. So I think that by itself is enough to show the immorality of the present ideological regime that governs the life of Jews and Palestinians between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, and which is internationally legitimized, unfortunately. And partly, with this I would end. I told you I need the foul, I like to end. And partly because we are still enjoying the warmth of the street lamp. And we are all afraid of the darkness. So maybe we need some workshops that the darkness is actually not so bad. And we can teach each other how to whistle in the darkness. So that we'll start the real journey for justice and reconciliation in Palestine. And not stuck where it's comfortable but not useful. Thank you.